And we are live. Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode of the Black Powder Podcast, the only podcast that puts a white dude from Arkansas and a black dude from California together weekly to talk about gold, guns, and god awful government. Now, we talk a lot on the Firearms Radio Network, who we're brought to you by proudly about guns. But oftentimes on the Black Powder Podcast, we're not talking about guns. And some of you wonder why that is. And we often tell you the reason why that is because we want to bring you libertarian discussions, because the Libertarian Party is the only party, in our opinion, that actually stands for your 2A rights. And remember, your right to self-defense comes from God, not from government. The only restriction is on government, not on you or on God. So again, I'm Michael White, your co-host tonight, aka MW for Liberty. As always, joined by my melanated brother-in-arms, Mr. Marcus Matthews in California. Marcus, how are you doing, brother?
I am just doing tippy-tappy. Good evening to you all. I am going by the moniker of Marcus Matthews, the Libertarian MVP of 2023.
You're the MVP tonight? Okay, fair enough, man.
MVP.
You were the Libertarian Kingmaker, the Libertarian Daddy Spanker. You've been all kinds of things, man.
I don't spank daddies.
I don't know, man. I don't know what you do over there.
Well, this is California. Yeah,
yeah, I don't know what you do in California.
Man, but I was born in Texas, and only two things come out of Texas.
Marcus, I got to ask you, man. I'm looking at you on camera tonight. You seem a little bit lighter this week. Have you been eating more like bland chicken? What happened?
Unseasoned chicken has been the bane of my existence for all, you mentioned your birth date. I'm 10 years younger than you. But, in California, it's been raining for like 4 months straight, so I haven't been outside.
Dude, your melanin count is definitely down, man. I'm telling you. I'm
trying
to get mine up.
Dance.
I'm trying to get ours even, man. That's what I'm trying to do, dude. I'm trying to get ours even.
With the tornadoes, you can't do that. You got to get actual sunshine.
That's right. So for all of you listening at home, who are not watching live, we had a devastating tornado here in Little Rock, Arkansas, 600 yards wide for 32 miles. We had 80,000 homes affected. So continue to pray for and do anything you can to help the citizens of Little Rock. We're bouncing back pretty good. But we're not gonna dwell on that. We have a really awesome guest tonight, and I mean, and so Marcus, I'll be honest, I'm not typically intimidated by guests we have. Okay,
nor awestruck.
Yeah, or awestruck. We've had some really awesome guests.
Yes.
That have worked really hard in the Liberty space, and it's not often that I sit down, I get my computer ready to do this broadcast, and I go, "Oh man, I might be in for it tonight. This is somebody that might be really, really, really awesome." So for you listening, most of you have probably forgotten more about the libertarian movement than the guest we have tonight has ever learned. Or I should say, she's probably forgotten more about the libertarian movement than you have ever learned. She has been involved in the liberty movement longer than I have been alive, almost as long as Marcus has been alive. She holds a PhD in biophysics from Michigan State. She is a renowned author in the libertarian space, writing a book known as Heal Our World. Healing Our World? Is it Healing Our World, Dr. Ruwart?
Healing Our
World. She has been involved in the Ron Paul campaign. She has done so many things, run for office. I cannot do her biography justice as an introduction. Healing Our World. Hashtag the Fire the Uniparty. There you go, Thomas Hill. Thank you. We got a comment coming in. Without further ado, Dr. Mary Ruwart, welcome to the Black Powder Podcast. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. Thank you for having me.
So there's not a really easy place to begin this conversation because you have an expertise in so many things. But as I understand it, most of your expertise involves, again, in biophysics. And so you have a unique perspective on some of the things we went through in the past few years, right? Specifically a certain coronavirus sickness that was going around, and the vaccines and the world of mandates that kind of happened around that. So, how do you think the Libertarian Party, the world, the government, the biopharmaceutical companies, how do you think that all was handled?
Terribly.
I loaded that question for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, we started out with the CDC supposedly putting together a test for the coronavirus, and the FDA said that nobody else in the private sector or government sector could provide a test. So the CDC took a long time to put this together, several weeks, and then it flopped. I mean, it was, the rumor is it was contaminated, which is really scary when you think that the CDC can't keep a clean lab, if that's really true. But I mean, they couldn't obviously put the test together. And so we lost here in the United States, we lost a couple months. We could have bought the test from Europe, but we didn't. So we were flying blind. So that was the beginning. And it just got worse from there. I hate to say it.
So
it got worse from there.
So, Doctor, early on during the pandemic, and I'm talking about March, April, of 2020, many people were hearing rumors that the test was flawed in and of itself, that PCR was a flawed science if it was ramped to too many cycles. And I think that we came to learn that average labs are running cycles of 34 to 40 cycles. Can you kind of explain to the audience what PCR is and why that number of cycles might produce a false result?
Right. Well, our technology isn't good enough to measure a few viruses in your nose.
Okay.
So what happens is the sample that's taken from your nose or your saliva or wherever has to be amplified. So what they do is they basically keep increasing the amount of virus by the technology that we do have. And they call each of these amplifications a cycle.
Okay.
That's what you were talking about. And if you do too many cycles, you start having a lot of false positives, which means that you're told you have COVID when you actually do not. And at about 30 cycles to 40 cycles, somewhere in there, it's about 80% false positives.
Wow.
It's really high. Now, of course, if you want to do if you want to take the high road, so to speak, and say, well, why would somebody do this? Then you could say, well, they didn't want to miss any positives, so they did this. But it really created a lot of problems because not everyone was using the high cycles. And of course, you had so many false positives that the number of cases that are being reported almost certainly are high.
Really?
Not low. Yeah.
And so speaking to that, we had this sort of disappearance of influenza. What do you attribute that to? What is your opinion on why influenza disappeared? I've heard that it disappeared because we were wearing masks and we were socially distancing. But then why didn't COVID disappear? That's kind of my question.
Right. Well, first of all, you have to realize that studies that have come out of this whole thing have shown that masks can't prevent it. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out why. If you put a mask on, like there's little, it's not flush against your skin. It would have to be like pushing in on your skin at least. And it would have to have a type of special material so that you would not pick up a virus. I mean, it's almost impossible, frankly. So without really special equipment. So all these cloth masks and stuff, they
didn't do anything.
No. And actually, what's interesting, we're talking about the CDC again, they put out a study saying masks work. But if you actually read the paper, which I did, they saw a 1% difference. 1%.
Wow.
You really have to be a scientist to go, hey, in science, we have a name for that. It's called statistically significant, but clinically insignificant, right? It makes no difference. So, and social distancing, the lockdown, same thing. The studies that are coming out pretty much show that none of that worked, right? So, so the flu didn't disappear. The flu is mostly a coronavirus too. And what happened, though, is that anybody who had the flu probably got counted as a coronavirus, sufferer, just because, first of all, the tests were ramped up in such a way they were going to give you a lot of false positives. And secondly, we haven't studied the flu the way we did, COVID-19. We never tested for it the way we tested for COVID-19. In fact, it's kind of hard to do. So You really couldn't tell, right? So if somebody had symptoms, oftentimes people said, "Oh, that's coronavirus," and in fact, hospitals were encouraged, doctors were encouraged to make that diagnosis of coronavirus if there was any symptomatology at all. So, and some of the hospitals got paid extra. Most of them did actually, if they had a diagnosis of COVID for a patient. There was a substantial amount of money. I can't recall the exact numbers, in the neighborhood of $10,000.
I believe it was $10,000 to $36,000 from CMS for
Well,
a COVID
yeah,
diagnosis. Yeah.
the 36,000 was if they were on a ventilator, I believe.
Ooh, right.
30,000 to put them on a ventilator, I think. I mean, don't quote me as the exact number.
And don't quote
but
me either, audience.
Oh,
that was in the,
quick question. I'm sorry.
no, that's-
So let's say Dr. Ruwart was at the CDC, the head of the CDC, which I would find to be an incredible candidate for that position. I'm just going to
Sure.
put that out there. What would have been your guidance in, let's say, March 2020?
Yeah.
When
Good question.
where would you have been?
well, the person who invented the PCR test really said you couldn't use it to diagnose anything. But if I were going to use that test, I certainly would have been, I wouldn't have ramped it up like it was done, because that gives you a false idea and then you can't treat people properly, right? You surely have some flu victims in there. And COVID itself presented differently. And what I would have recommended is that if somebody died of COVID, we autopsy them. That's what you do to find out what's going on. But actually, the guidance was don't autopsy them because, you might get sick from it. Well,
Wow.
when we autopsy people, there are precautions that are taken because you don't know if the person especially in a hospital setting, the person that you're autopsying might have something contagious. So that really set us back as well. So we didn't have a really good test for months. When we did get a test, it was flawed. I mean, its creator even said, don't use it the way you're using it. And then there were no autopsies. And had there been autopsies, probably we would have found out very early as, hey, we're getting some problems with clotting and things of this nature, and it would have helped us at least treat the symptoms. In fact, that's what you normally do when you have a new disease, is you treat the symptoms. But that's not the guidance that we got from our government. They said, oh, there's nothing, don't try to treat it, you can't do it. When people come into the hospital and they test positive for COVID, send them home and tell them that if they start having trouble breathing, then they should come in. Well, by then, the virus has multiplied, really made you sick. And we have drugs that are antivirals, and we've had them for decades.
Right.
So that was very but there's a political reason for that, I believe. And the political reason is that you can't get an emergency use authorization for a vaccine if there's any other treatment. And so all the people who were doing early treatment really got shut down. I mean, in fact, many of them lost their license. And we're not talking about, the run-of-the-mill doctors here. We're talking about Peter McCullough, like just about the top cardiologists in the country. Yeah, and we're talking about other people who were in the trenches. They were the ones working with patients.
Yep.
Fauci would make these proclamations, and to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't treated a single patient. I mean, I don't actually think I don't even know if he technically is qualified.
So Dr. Ruwart,
right? And I don't know if he has, I don't know what his.
So Dr. Ruwart, I saw a video once with the inventor of the PCR test, an interview from, I believe, the 90s, maybe even the late 80s. And the gentleman's name, help me recall it, who invented the PCR test.
You know what? I'm sorry.
It is on the tip of my tongue. And if you'd asked me 5 minutes before this broadcast, I could have told you. But I watched an interview with him from the 90s, and he basically sort of lambasted Dr. Fauci, said that he had no problems lying at all, that he was at best an administrator. He was not a clinician. He was not he was not a technician. That he would do whatever basically anyone told him to do. And I found that to be pretty substantial evidence when the gentleman who has invented the test that's being purported to be correct is telling you not to use it for this reason. And then he's also indicting the individual who's supporting the use of the test. I mean, how much more do we have to say? Honestly.
Kerry Mullis.
Kerry Mullis, that's him. Yeah, Dr. Kerry Mullis. And oddly enough, and so for all of you listening at home, if you want to put your tinfoil hat on for a few moments, I believe Kerry Mullis died roughly 6 months before the pandemic began. Is that correct? What's his death? August of 2018?
I thought it was around
2019.
August of
2019.
So around 6 months. Totally convenient. Totally convenient. We'll leave that one to the side. We'll leave that one to the side. So for those of you who at home that are listening that don't understand, my background's a little bit in legislation, right, and legislative research. So CMS, basically Medicare, Medicaid, they are responsible for 75 to 80% of all facility funding. You don't have to take Medicare or Medicaid, but if you don't, you're probably going to die as a public hospital. That's just the truth, right? And Dr. Ruwart would probably agree with me on that. And so their guidelines are pretty strict. They want certain things handled. And then, of course, AMA comes into this. We want doctors to do this certain thing. They come down to the licensing boards. And so what we've had happen in this country is we've removed the ability for doctors to be doctors. They have to follow protocols. And so help me kind of understand and help the audience understand. There was a certain group of doctors who early on said, hey, we have treatments for these symptoms. Budesonide is a steroid to open up airways. We can, hydrochloroquine to increase zinc uptake into cells for ACE2 inhibitors. We have some things we can do that can help alleviate symptoms because symptom treatment is the frontline thing a doctor should do. Tell us about that group of doctors and kind of what happened to them.
Well, they got trashed in the mainstream media. Some of them lost their license, and others formed alliances. In fact, there's just down the road in Dallas, there's going to be a group of doctors, some of whom have really been vilified. They're having a training for doctors on how to treat not only long COVID, but vaccine injury.
Oh, yeah.
So, yes. So what's happened to these doctors is the whole idea of trying to shut them up has really truly backfired. It made them so angry and so recognizing that they are basically the only doctors that a lot of these poor people have. The vaccine injured and the people with long COVID are totally pretty much ignored by the average doctor. So these guys are getting together, and gals, because actually, the America's Frontline Doctors was,
That's who I was asking about the group, the America's Frontline Doctors. That's yes, correct.
Yeah. And so trashed. In fact, if you look at the email dumps that came out of the lawsuits and the FOIA requests, you will see that Dr. Fauci actually, when talking about the Great Barrington Declaration, said that I don't remember who he was talking to in the email, but he said we need to shut these people down.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's out. If you can find it, it's on the internet. So
wow.
If you really want a copy and can't find it, I might be able to dig mine out. I've got a huge file.
So, Doctor, you kind of lean into a kind of a different topic now. I read recently that the very first COVID vaccine injury payouts were occurring from the vaccine fund that exists, and they were in the amount of, I believe, $1,500, $1,800, $1,200, and these are significant injuries: myocarditis, anaphylaxis, recurrent anaphylaxis. Significant things that affect quality of life and likely livelihood and lifelong prospects. These are people whose lives have probably been shortened statistically by 10 to 15 years. And they're getting paid out $1,500, $1,800. So vaccine injuries are real. They're not a conspiracy. They do exist. The government set up a fund to pay out people. under, I believe, the Reagan administration, right? And that's how we got childhood vaccine schedules. Tell us about some of the vaccine injuries that are occurring.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, of course, death is the biggest one.
Sure.
And that what's coming out now is that apparently it doesn't have to be within the first few days. Think about this sudden adult death syndrome. We never had that before.
Never heard about it ever before.
And everyone's saying, "Oh, we don't know what it is." But if you look at the, I think there's a pretty strong correlation, which causation is not necessarily correlation, but you get enough correlations, and then you have to be suspicious if you're any kind of researcher, right? And so we've got a lot of young people, especially, dying from these. And I want to tell your audience a little bit about why I was hesitant about these vaccines, and in a very simple way, so everyone can understand what's going on here. So, in a standard vaccine, you get a measured amount of antigen. That's the molecule that your body is going to make antibodies against, okay? So you get a measured amount. We all get the same amount, which can be problematic if you're a tiny person like me, but at least we all get the same amount, right? But that's not what these COVID vaccines are. In the COVID vaccine, we get instructions for our body to make the antigen. And if you have a very aged body, what the data is looking like is your body is not equipped to make very much spike protein. But if you have a young, healthy body, and this is a little bit of speculation on my part, I want to be very upfront when I'm talking about this. If you have a younger body, you can make a lot of spike protein. Or if not younger, if you're genetically, we're different genetically, right? So when you get the instructions to make the antigen, you don't know how much your body's going to make.
So what you're saying is the instruction set that's being given to the body doesn't have a limit on it. It basically says, make what the dose can make. And everyone's different. So, because for instance, if like me and Marcus were to sit down and bench press, I guarantee I could bench press more than him. Right?
Hell no.
You might get an argument about that.
Let me remind you, I'm 6'5".
I don't care, Marcus. I'll out bench any day. But so that's what I'm saying is that everyone's body's different, right? And so, so audience, if you're hearing this correctly, you're giving an instruction set to your body that says produce this without any limits. Basically, until the mechanism is exhausted, and that mechanism can be exhausted in some people in a day. It might be exhausted in others in 2 weeks, right? And as I understand it, the spike protein itself is a toxin, correct?
Yes, and it can last. We don't know how long exactly it lasts, but it lasts for, in most people, at least 2 months.
Where are they finding?
That's how far they've done the study out to. So it could be lasting a lot longer.
So, doctor, where are they finding spike protein in the body?
Everywhere. Pretty much everywhere. But let me explain something. Another thing about these vaccines.
Sure.
These instructions are not just shot into your arm willy-nilly. They are encased in what we call a lipid nanoparticle, which was designed to cross the blood-brain barrier and get cancer drugs into, the brain to fight brain tumors, right? That was
glioblastoma, things like that.
Exactly. Right. Now, I don't think I'm not up on how much this has been used in real life. I think because there are problems with the lipid nanoparticles. They are inflammatory, which is bad.
Sure.
Just think bad when you hear inflammatory. So what happens is these instructions are probably going to cross the blood-brain barrier. In fact, we know from the studies that have been done already that some of it does. The spike protein is found in the brain. It's found in the ovaries. It's found in the testes. In fact, it's found in fairly great amounts in the reproductive organs. And there is speculation that one of the products um, of these instructions looks a lot like a protein that women need to make sure that the fetus is properly implanted in the uterus and the placenta is attached properly. So if that actually turns out to be the case, then there's going to be some problems in conception and carrying a baby to term. Now, the studies that have been done have been very ambiguous. The first paper that came out on the effect of the vaccines on pregnancy had the title and the abstract said, "Oh yeah, there's no problem here." But if you actually look and read the paper, like I did, that's not what you find. One of the tables shows that in the first trimester there was 82% basically miscarriages in the first trimester, which makes sense. The first trimester is that time when the child is most vulnerable. And then the second and third trimester, much less in the way of problems. So, and this paper actually had quite a few patients that were in their second or third trimester. So when you averaged it all out, it didn't look like anything unless you divided it into the first, second, and third trimester. Now, since then, other papers have come out claiming that that's not the case. The first trimester, it's totally safe. But there have been critiques of those studies, and I have not read all of those papers, so I can't really say. I just know the first one that came out was very damning for the first trimester, and the animal studies. If you look at the Pfizer documents, that also, the Pfizer documents, Pfizer wanted to keep them sealed for 75 years.
Yeah, nothing to hide. Nothing to hide, people. Just don't let us release them for 75 years. Yeah, right? Yeah.
But if you actually look at the Pfizer documents, what you see is they had quite a few pregnancies in their studies. They only reported on a few of them, and I'll tell you why this is a problem in a minute. But they only reported in a few of them, but in the few they reported, there again was a high miscarriage rate. And they also had more people die in the vaccine group than in the placebo group, but it wasn't significantly different. But what they died of was heart disease. It was myocarditis, heart attack, which is consistent with what we know about the side effects of the vaccine today. There's a bunch of other stuff in the Pfizer documents, but what happened is one of the nonprofits, ICANN, sued to get those documents earlier, and now presumably they've all been turned over basically to the public at this point, because they had to do it all in 2022. I have not read them all, but there are a lot of people looking at them. And of course, when I talk to you about the distribution of the spike protein in the body from the vaccine, that is in these Pfizer documents too. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And what I haven't seen, though, is what we call the informed consent that the people in the study got. Now, a little thing you don't know about me. Every week, I sit on, what we call an ethical review board or an independent review board. And anyone who wants to do human research in this country and in other countries, this is from the Nuremberg trials where we executed Nazis for doing experiments on
Or we brought them here to make rockets. Just depends.
It was all skill set. It
Just
depends
depends on what you could do.
Right. But anyhow, so every week I'm part of a board that decides whether this research can go forward. And, there are certain rules that were set into place by international law and also by the U.S. government's decisions. And our government has violated all of them, pretty much, in putting out these vaccines. you know, and so our government, and actually other governments too, are violating these international laws that were passed because of the Germans. And one of them is you can't force somebody to be in a study.
Right.
And you can't use coercion of any kind, like this idea of you can't stay employed if you don't take the vaccine. This is totally prohibited. The fact that you might get lap dances or $100 or a chance at the lottery.
Right.
We can't allow the subjects to be overpaid because, if you really aren't allowed to like induce somebody with large payments, because that's considered a form of coercion. So all this stuff the government is doing is totally illegitimate. And of course, under the emergency use authorization, everybody who got the vaccine should have gotten an informed consent, which generally is about 20 pages long. That's the short ones.
Sure. And you're
Okay.
saying you haven't, and so what you're saying, doctor, is you haven't seen those yet.
No, and well, in the study, I'm sure in the study there were informed consents because the IRBs, the boards like my own, would not have permitted the studies to go forward without an informed consent. Pfizer knows that. All the drug companies know this. I'm sure they.
So, doctor, a simple question is, again, there's this issue with the COVID vaccine has become very politically divisive. There are people who will defend it in light of anything, and there are people who are kind of opposed to it in light of anything, right? And probably eventually somewhere the truth will find ourselves in the middle, where there's probably some good and some bad. But what you're telling me here, if I'm hearing you correctly, is had this been any other treatment for any other thing, the way that this was done would have not been allowed.
That's correct.
Okay, and that's really where I feel that this hinges on. When I make criticisms of the government response to COVID, specifically with vaccines and mandates, and again, what I believe is them propping up corporate interests to allow these mandates to exist in the workplace. And for instance, then we had the case with OSHA and the case with the CMS mandates. What I always go back to is time out. We'd have never done this with anything else. That's
right.
my issue. So whether it was good or whether it's bad or whether it's somewhere in the middle, you've confirmed for me that suspicion, which is this is unprecedented.
That's correct.
Well, quick, might I interject real quick? During that smallpox outbreak in New York City back in, I think it was the late 1800s, there was forced vaccinations where they were taking smallpox scabs. And I'm not trying to lessen this, but my question to Dr. Ruwart is, where's the government's end game in doing this? Because this did have some historical precedents.
Well, to Marcus, to one point, that was before the Nuremberg codes. Okay, that's around 50,
that is true.
That's about 50 years before we said human experimentation was bad. But yeah, where do you so Dr. Ruwart, that's a really good question. What is the end game here? Was this a profit motive? Was this an incompetent motive? Or is this a combination of the two?
A wealth transfer, or what was it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there were multiple ones. Well, wealth transfer certainly happened. I mean, a huge amount of money went from the poor to the 1%. And in other words, there's a big shift.
And continues to via inflation. I mean,
yes. Inflation hurts the poor the most. I mean,
right.
They're the ones that really get it, and people on fixed income, which is why I'm still working in my 70s. I'm not sure I want to stop.
We didn't think you were a day over 50.
I'm pretty sure we went to high school together.
So for those of you listening who are not watching the broadcast, because most of y'all listen later via audio, Dr. Ruwart is a very attractive 70-year-old. So she looks very good for her age. So she's taking care of herself. She might know what she's doing here. So little hats off to you.
Listen to her. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Listen to her. She might know what she's doing here. Let's continue. Sorry, doctor.
That's okay. I kind of lost my train of thought. My head is so swollen.
So again, if this is unprecedented, and we don't really know necessarily what the end game is.
Oh, the end game is okay. Yeah. I think there's several end games.
Okay.
Certainly a shift in wealth. Okay, that I think was anticipated. And the reason I say that that's, we saw all the mom and pop businesses having to be shut down, but Walmart could stay open.
Right.
All the Amazon still stayed open. Everybody who is big got to stay open. So that's one of the things. But there could be, of course, I can only speculate. My suspicion is there's a depopulation agenda. Bill Gates has been very vocal about that we have to cut back on population, and that one way to do it is vaccines, which, like when you think about the average person thinks about a vaccine, they think it's saving lives, right? So how could this be depopulation? But of course, we're having now a lot of deaths coming up. In fact, in the working age group, the group that has life insurance given to them by their employers, this is one of the healthiest groups around. And, their age, if the 21 to 49 age group is actually showing huge.
I just turned 50. I'm
death
sorry.
rate. Yeah, the insurance companies are reporting huge rates of death. And, like they're saying if there was 10% more deaths, that would be a once in a lifetime event. But they're reporting 20, 30, 40% is the highest number I've seen. So this is beyond a lifetime event.
So just anecdotally speaking for the audience, I know several people who work at fairly large corporate employers. I'm not going to name the companies, but there are people who work in various large industries, and they're very large players in those industries. And anecdotally speaking, they have had more coworkers of that age group die of cardiac events in the last 18 months than they ever knew of anyone dying either from or with COVID. And that's just anecdotally speaking. So again, that doesn't mean that it's scientific data. I'm just saying that I am blessed to have people that work in insurance, finance, accounting, logistics, for very large places. And this is something that is being reported from corporations. This is happening.
That's right.
And again, you mentioned earlier a very astute observation that correlation does not equal causation. So we'll be very clear to say that, but something is going on. Something is going on. Yeah.
Yes. And that's been, I think I've seen the Medicare data and different data from different countries that go along and support this idea that we are seeing not only a greater, more all-cause mortality,
right,
but we are also seeing less. There's no baby boom; it's just the opposite.
That's correct.
Baby doom, I call it, and this. It's just the opposite of what you'd expect if everyone had to be locked down, right? Because when they're locked down, what are they going to do, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So okay, so that's another thing. Now, but I think there is also a big push going on to move closer to world government with the World Health Organization being a pivotal group, because they've started putting out documents that they want to have ratified, but actually not ratified in the way we normally think of everybody getting together and having a say, but they want to kind of slide these things in. And they've always had such documents, but now they're starting to talk about things like if there's some type of disease going on in a country and the World Health Organization calls it a pandemic, and only they get to say that, then they can dictate exactly what must be done in that country. And even if it violates the Constitution of that country, which is kind of a sneaky way of getting world government.
Well, so us libertarians often point out that unelected bureaucrats of federal agencies are the single greatest threat to constitutional rights, right?
Yes.
We have pointed this out with the weaponization of the IRS, whether it's against civil rights activists or whether it's against conservatives. We have mentioned this about the ATF with them inventing new laws, quote unquote, by regulations. We recently had a Supreme Court case discussing this with the EPA. When you basically create these agencies and you give them secretarial power and Chevron deference over the law, and then you allow them to do something, you create a moral hazard. And so what you're saying, doctor, is there's a possibility of this same thing happening on a world scale, right?
That's right. That's
Wow.
right. And in addition to that, to kind of put the icing on that particular cake, there has been a definite push by many governments to have to move to digital currency. And
Yes.
once they do that, it kind of actually very similar to what China does. In other words, China has a social credit score, and so they judge you not. I mean, well, they shouldn't be judging you at all unless you're committing a crime, right? But if you don't toe the line and do what the government says, then your credit score goes down. And what happened? And I think this has been fairly well documented, although I haven't seen. I guess I haven't seen enough to say it's absolute. But during the pandemic, for example, when they found out some of the Chinese were going to protest because they didn't want to be locked down, all of a sudden their social credit score went down far enough that that changed. They couldn't leave their apartment. So in other words, they'll punish you. And one of the ways they punish you with digital currency is they can turn off your currency. All of your savings can be gone. Now, technically in the U.S., we've seen the IRS pull that stunt, or at least try to. So we know that the IRS used to really basically be able to take your stuff without any due process. And there was a lot of pushback on that. So now there's some due process, but it's not perfect, right? So
and one of the interesting things about studying CBDCs in their current form, doctor, is that we have really one hard example, which is again China with a social credit score somewhat tied or eventually tied to this. And the problem is we don't have great data because it's China. They're not very forthcoming with how they're doing it, right? So we have some soft examples in India and Nigeria, which also launched some digital currencies. India went cashless, essentially de facto cashless in 2016. And we've seen that same sort of thing. We saw it with the trucker protest in Canada. So we've seen this idea of, whether, again, and I want the audience to understand this, if you're super pro COVID vaccine, if you think Joe Biden's the greatest thing in the world, you love Anthony Fauci, that's fine. But one day you might disagree with something. And because you might disagree with it, whether you are right or you are wrong, government shouldn't have the ability to demonetize you or not allow you participation in society. And
that's already happened here in America, though.
Right, and it's happening everywhere. And I think that's what Dr. Ruwart is pointing out, is that a lot of this is kind of all folded into each other, that we can't really talk about one of these topics without really talking about another one. Because it's not just a disease, it's also a bureaucracy. It's not just a bureaucracy, it's also the pharmaceutical companies. It's not just that, it's the taxpayers. It's not just that, it's the currency system. And they're all together, basically. So this really is a topic that kind of umbrellas all topics, really.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. And, I'd like to say one more thing, too, since we're talking libertarian, too.
Sure.
I have run into, because I'd like to address this, so I've run into some libertarians who think the mandates are appropriate. And of course, usually they're people who aren't in the medical field, don't understand the nuances of how you really never know. I worked in the drug industry for a while. I was fortunate. I worked with a pretty ethical company. And one of the things when you work in the industry is that no drug is completely safe. I don't care if it's a vaccine or a drug. I mean, somebody is going to be hurt by it. And most drugs can kill people. I mean, aspirin kills a couple hundred people a year.
So the audience, we get the word pharma from pharmakia, which has two meanings in Greek. It can mean poison or cure. It's all about dose. Pretty much anything will kill you if you have enough of it. That's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also your individual body. I mean, there's some people who are just super sensitive to stuff, and other people are not. And so somebody is going to get hurt. The question is, where do you draw the line? Well, with the swine flu vaccine, we drew the line at 53 deaths.
That's right. And so, Doctor, real quick, I want to back up. You bring up a good point for those listening at home. There was a 60 Minutes episode on swine flu vaccine, which is still archived on YouTube from the 1970s. Go watch it. Go watch it and look at the reaction of the public and the government when 53 people died. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Continue. I'm sorry, Doctor. Yeah.
No, that's right. And theirs, which is like underreported by a factor of, I mean, depending on which study you look, it looks like maybe 1% of all cases are reported, or 10% at the most. And I think we're coming down on, over 30,000 deaths in the U.S.
Wow.
Pretty much.
Wow.
And so, this is, and the, you still hear, oh, safe and effective. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as a drug that's safe for everyone. There's no such thing as a drug that will work for everyone. And so in fact, the FDA had that on their website at one time. When I was giving talks that kind of evolved into my book, Death by Regulation, I used to talk about this, and they took it down. They took that page down, right?
Because I think if we all have a social credit score, our scores are all going down a little bit from having this conversation tonight. So just saying.
Yeah. Well, mine will probably go down more because I'm black, and
you're right, dude. Absolutely. Instantly 10 more points, Marcus. I've told you that, man. I always started the broadcast off. I said you were lighting up again. You probably should just stay inside.
Might as well. I have a question.
Yeah, can I, before you answer
sure,
that,
let her wrap up.
Okay,
I was kind of working up to this mandate business, because some libertarians believe in them, and the argument I hear from them is, well, if you're a danger to other people if you're not vaccinated, but the fact of the matter is, no vaccines are totally effective, right? And besides, if you believe the vaccine's effective and you take it, then what do you have to worry about if you think you're 100% protected, right? So it doesn't make any sense to have everybody taking the vaccine. In fact, it's the wrong thing to do in a pandemic, but a lot of immunologists have said that. That's not me talking. So that was crazy too. But anyhow, I just want to point that out because I'd like libertarians to, I think libertarians in general should understand that it's our responsibility to take care of ourselves. And obviously, if we purposely try to infect somebody, okay, that's one thing. But if you think that we're ever going to be able to live in a community and not pass bugs around, it's just not happening.
So, Dr. Ruwart, I'll tell you sort of my argument that I've had this conversation happen a few times with a few libertarians who supported mandates, and they gave me similar arguments, which was, if you don't take one, you're violating the NAP because you might infect somebody else, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, we learned later that it didn't matter. You can still infect people, that sort of thing. But at some point in time, we have to temper that with the ability to live. I have to be able to drive a car and locomote myself around. The possibility is I might cause an accident, right? I have to be able to live my life. I have to be able to do things. Life inherently is dangerous. On a long enough timeline, the mortality for everyone is 100%. None of us get out of here alive, right? And so we have to be very careful with that slippery slope, I personally believe, of, well, you need to do this to keep other people safe. My argument has always been, if it's not a direct, inherent action that does it, it doesn't need to be discussed, right? That's kind of my feeling about it. And I think hopefully so. I would hope that more libertarians are kind of coming to that side of the argument as we learn more things. But my fear has always been how quickly people were steered and we're kind of drawn into the media frenzy. Marcus, you had a question, brother.
Yeah, now it's a two-part question. First of all, not to dismiss Dr. Ruwart here, but I've never heard anyone in my 50 years say locomote in order to describe their travels.
It's a white person word, man. We laid the railroads. It's a white people
Yeah.
word. Yeah, I got it, man.
That is. I commend you on that. That's why this is awesome. Locomotive. Okay,
Yeah.
but I just want to expand on. We've talked about the efficacy of the vaccines and whatnot. Where do you think the American diet played a role in this pandemic and the fact that we effectively eat like 100% total crap? Because there is not one healthy fast food restaurant. I don't care where you go.
Good
There is
question.
not one
Good question.
healthy fast food restaurant available.
Yeah, Dr.
to
Ruwart,
Americans.
why wasn't the CDC recommending exercise, diet?
Going
yeah,
outside to get vitamin D, right? I mean, that's what that would be the natural thing. In fact, they recommended just the opposite. I mean, and of course, if you've ever looked at the food pyramid, it's.
I remember the food pyramid. Yeah.
Yeah,
The food pyramid came out right around when Acid Rain came out. Remember that? They were like hand in hand. Right?
Yeah, the food pyramid is really horrible even now. It's high in carbs, and that's most of us don't handle carbs well. About a third of us can do it, but 2/3 of us we'll get diabetes, heart disease, and the whole bit. Because our bodies aren't geared to handle that many carbs. So it's really sad. So I think that had a big contribution. And if you think about it, that may be why our athletes are dying from the vaccine, because they're healthy, right? They've got to be relatively healthy. Of course, if they push themselves really hard, they become inflamed in order to do what they do, but they get away with it because they're usually younger, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I mean, that's a huge thing. And actually, I've given talks before on longevity studies, that of what we know will help us. And one of the thing everybody in the anti-aging research groups always agree on is that the best way, if you want to live a long time, is to eat less. Eat nutritious stuff and eat less. Caloric restriction.
I'm going to say this real quick.
Marcus, you hear that? You got to stop barbecuing so much, man. You out there grilling every
that's
day.
not going to happen. I am a consummate carnivore.
I'm telling you.
Apparently, Dr. Ruwart is the president and chief emperor of the Anti-Aging Society.
I would concur. I would concur.
I mean,
I would concur.
She looks simply amazing.
She's going to come back on the podcast just to have our compliments. I think that's what
I would have her back on just to stare at her for an hour.
So Doctor, as we kind of wrap this conversation up about kind of the mandates and the virus and everything else that we're kind of into right now, where do we go from here as a society? I mean, where does the average American, where should their focus be politically and then in their community?
Well, if they want to have their liberties and their rights, then they need to start focusing on trying to take away the power the government has basically taken on itself to do all these things. I mean, do we want to have our employment dependent on getting a vaccine or some medical treatment that we might not want? Do we want do we want to be locked down, because that's what's coming? Do we want to have our currency to be such that the government totally controls it? I mean, do we want these things? And of course, as libertarians, we've never wanted these things.
Right.
But I think most Americans, I'd like to say most, that's probably not accurate, but a lot of Americans woke up. That's the good news of this whole pandemic. They realize that the government oversteps. Unfortunately, a lot of people I know are lockstep in that still. And it's scary because friends and family are in that category for me and for a lot of people. And it's really sad to see. And people they don't want to hear an opposing side. And the reason they don't want to hear it, and I'd like to share this with libertarians because it will help you talk to people if you understand this. So, abused spouses go back to the person who abused them. And they believe the lie, which the lie is told, I love you. I won't do it again.
Right.
But of course they do, right?
Yeah.
And even children that are abused, if you try to take them away from their parents, no, they want to live with their parents. And the reason that people don't want to see their government as their enemy or as somebody who's trying to not help them, but is happy to consider them collateral damage if the government and bureaucrats and the people who the special interests who actually do run the government, if it's hard for people to believe that government is an abusive parent,
Right.
or an abusive spouse.
That's very well said.
If you think of it that way, then you realize what you're up against, and then you can actually direct your comments in such a way that you can help people see that. But you have to kind of give them a soft landing place, because it's horrific to think that these people who tell you they love you and they're out to help you are not, that they're just the opposite. So this is an issue that we all have to be very aware of. It's hard.
Sadly, for everyone that you said that's woken up, and again, I ran a race in 2022, and I was able to talk to a lot of voters, and this was something that I could talk to many different type of voters about, and I could see that for every one face that woke up, there may be 0.5 faces that doubled down. There were people who dug into the narrative, who dug into the protection, who dug in to give me safety, not liberty. Oh, I'm scared. Please keep me safe. I don't care what you do to me. And we've seen that evident by the re-election of Gretchen Whitmer, things like that. I mean, so what is the practical solution, for converting those individuals? Is there a magic wand? Is there something to say, or is this a complicated person-to-person effort that we may not absolutely win?
Well, I think we will win in the long run if we don't blow ourselves up. I mean, that's always a possibility, right?
Yeah.
But the reason I think that is that by nature, every individual wants their own personal happiness, right?
Right.
And how do we get there? Well, I used to think, like many people, that it had to do with material things, but it really doesn't, right? So what it has, of course, you need enough to live. Don't get me wrong. I'm not doing that, but I actually had an opportunity to talk with someone who is responsible for a lot of the propaganda. This is back in back in the Reagan days.
Okay.
I'm dating myself.
I was there.
So I had a chance to visit with him because we were in a situation where we had time, right? And I could see he was not a very happy guy. And so I asked him, what do you want out of life? And he said, power and money. He didn't hesitate.
Wow.
I was like, who would ever say that?
Wow.
But he had power and money, right? And he's not happy. So I said, well, what do you think would make you happy? And he said, I think to be happy, I would have to feel aligned, or that's not the word he used. Let me think about this. I would have to feel connected. That was the word. I would have to feel connected to humankind.
Wow.
And I didn't really understand that answer, I have to say, for several years, until it really struck me that he spent his time lying to everyone, including his own family, from what he had said to me, and lying to the American people. And to do that to do that consistently, you have to disconnect yourself from humankind, right?
Good
Because
point. Yeah.
you feel connected, you would never do that to people, right? The
Yeah. Good
people,
point.
so by being an aggressor, because that's what he was trying to convince people of things that weren't true. So by being an aggressor, before you can do that, you have to separate yourself and say, oh, these people are too stupid to realize I'm lying. Or, if I can trick them, that's good for me and bad for them. I mean, you're separating yourself, right? There's no connection. You're weakening that connection. So what I realized is that he's probably right. Happiness requires some connection to humankind because we're social animals. We're built that way. Wow. Biologically.
I think that I'm sorry, that is the greatest argument for school choice I've ever heard. What you guys just said right now.
Yeah, and so the nice thing is that the aggressors aggress because they think it's going to make them happier. But when the light bulb goes off and you realize, wait a minute, by aggressing, I'm losing the very thing I'm going after. When that becomes more widespread in our culture, and it doesn't have to be a lot, 5 to 10% is all it takes to change things. When that becomes understood, then people aren't going to regress because it's not in their best interest. They might think it's in their immediate best interest, but as far as the long term, it is not.
Someone once described for me that liberty was a selfish selflessness.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
That's right. It benefited me to benefit someone else. And that's why it works. And that's what happens. So Doctor, we're coming up on an hour here. And so we're not up against a hard deadline, but we probably should begin to wrap this discussion up.
Sure.
We've talked about a lot of things. We talked about COVID a lot. We talked about mandates. We talked about vaccines, injuries. We talked about sort of the relationship between pharma and government and the people and everything else. Where can people find your work? And what's the name of your most recent work?
Death by Regulation: How We Were Robbed of a Golden Age of Health and How We Can Reclaim It.
Okay, and so in the kind of 30 to 45 second elevator pitch, what is the work about?
It shows that the 1962 changes to the Food and Drug Administration Act shave 5 to 10 years off each of our lives.
Wow, death by regulation.
And what we need to do, obviously, deregulate to change that.
So, Doctor, where can people find your book?
Well, I'm on Amazon.
Okay.
When I get my website back up, I've been hacked. So.
Oh no! Yeah.
I have a whole discussion. I work in IT. I have a little post that I like to talk about. Don't click on foreign links. Don't do. There's a lot of steps you could take to protect yourself. That's my expertise. We'll do a whole episode on that later.
Yeah, we'll deal with Doctor's Hack off the air. So Doctor, they can find you on Amazon, and I would hope that for you coming on this podcast, perhaps I could send you a copy and maybe get an autographed copy back, possibly.
Oh, sure.
Okay, I would love to do that, and we'll talk about that afterwards. So. We're going to wrap this episode up, guys. This has been an incredibly awesome conversation. Marcus, thank you for securing Dr. Mary here as a guest tonight. This has been awesome, man.
She's one of my favorite people in the world, so I want her to thank her immensely for coming on.
Before we go, Doctor, where can people find you on social media?
Oh, yes. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Okay, so all those places, just Google your name, and they'll find you. Dr. Mary Ruwart, Ruwart. You can find her PhD. And hopefully there's no fakers out there yet. You might probably after this podcast, though, have a couple people trying to catfish you. That might happen. So guys, if you get a love scam in your email, that might be, don't click on it. We just had that conversation. This has been an awesome episode, guys. Thank you for tuning into the Black Powder Podcast on the Power and Prayer Network. Before we go,
I want to secure another guest spot I'm going to put you on the spot here. Say you'll come on in another 3 to 6 months. And so we have legally binding contracts.
Yeah, it's binding. It's binding. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Well, everyone, again, thank you for tuning into the Black Powder Podcast presented here on Firearms Radio Network. As always, find us on Firearms Radio Network. Click our merchandise, like, subscribe, share this. Help us get past the algorithms. I'm sure that the topics we covered today are going to put us down bottom of the social credit score for a couple weeks. So we need you to help us out by getting our content out there. Marcus, as always, how do we wrap up our broadcast?
To my fellow Americans, always remember it's better to live free
or die.
One love.
One love.